Hey, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar at the Jerusalem Press Club on the latest developments in the war in Israel. I'm Talia Dekel-Fleissig. A bunch of things are going on. We're trying to understand ourselves. We know that last night the IDF made a few pinpoint entrances into the Gaza Strip. We know that the U.S. is ramping up its involvement as reports emerge that the administration is pressuring Israel to delay a full ground invasion, as well as potentially preparing for attacks in the north. At the same time, international actors are trying to create a coalition to fight Hamas, while the UN, of course, is voicing criticism against Israel's airstrike campaign in Gaza. To discuss the possibilities Israel faces now, at least in the next couple of days, because things, of course, change all the time, and perhaps which considerations the government should take. The Jerusalem Press Club welcomes back Dr. Eyal Hulata, former National Security Advisor under Prime Ministers Bennett and Lapid, today a visiting fellow in Washington with the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Dr. Hulata, thank you so much again for joining us.
Thank you, Talia, and thank you, everybody. I'll give a brief analysis of how I see the options going ahead at the moment. It's been a very tense and difficult day. And then, like previous times, we'll open it up to questions, and I'll be happy to give you my perspective on everything that is happening. I think the major thing we need to all keep our eyes open is whether or not there could be a chance to bring back hostages. This has been on the media over the last 48 hours, and as you know, I guess better than me, then when these things are on the media, it means there's something that is happening, not necessarily in fruition. And my understanding, nothing is finalized at this point that could allow for that. The Qatari involvement is of course perhaps an enabler to that, and you've seen Israeli high officials praise their involvement. This is very difficult, of course, in the face of things, because Qatar's participation in arming Hamas, of course, is clear as well, and this maybe gives you some kind of understanding of the complexity for the decision makers in Israel at this point to try to square two almost contradicting goals that are facing them. One is to rid of Hamas in Gaza, and the second is to bring back the hostages, or as many hostages as we can, as soon as possible, back home. So this is continuing to be a corner piece on it. I have to say that even though it is difficult, there is a need to make decisions on those issues, and I myself, I'm not in Israel to see this in full, but I'm not in full understanding on how and when those decisions will be made. And I think the public is also starting to accumulate attention and questions on this. The remarks on Netanyahu's speech are not favorable, and I think for good reason. And Gallant's press conference that is maybe just ended, some of you may have been on it. I'm not sure, also gave the clarity that the people are looking for after so long time once this is started. So this is one thing, of course, to look into. The second sphere is the IDF preparation. From my understanding, the level of preparedness is high, and the motivation to go in and to achieve substantial goals vis-a-vis Hamas are there. There's always the question of what is the IDF planning and how this will play out. To my understanding, there is enough flexibility in the planning process to allow the IDF to maneuver in a way that will not fall into the traps that are clearly there waiting for them by Hamas. and to perform based on what they will actually encounter once they go in. There is better intel by now and better preparedness and readiness, and this is another thing to follow over the next few days. As for Lebanon, I think that there isn't something dramatically that has changed in that. We're seeing the same rhetoric. The fact that by now almost 50 Hezbollah terrorists have been killed by IDF strikes is significant, and Hezbollah does not act according to what they have referred to as an equation, meaning that once their terrorist militants are hit, they strike back, and I think that says something about their lack of appetite at this point to enter, either because they're waiting to see what will happen on the ground operation, or a part of a larger Iranian approach to keep Hezbollah intact for future rounds with Israel, which is what I believe is happening. There is no reason for Iran to lose two of its properties at the same time. They inflicted enough pain on us, also from an Iranian perspective. And of course, the last piece, the international piece, we've all seen the Security Council attempt for a resolution. The fact that the Russians and the Chinese voted against does not come as a surprise. Of course, it's I wouldn't say even frustrating, because I think it was kind of expected on their behalf. The fact that the UAE voted against is also isn't very comforting, but we know their politics and the way they go about this previously. That also does not come as a surprise. But the wide support that Israel is getting from all of the Western countries and other participants in that discussion is important and unique 3 weeks into this campaign. I think it does not only signify the support that Israel is getting, but also, even if we are getting criticism from time to time, the understanding that Israel is doing its utmost to play this out according to the criteria that I know that we've kept also in the past, but not always were we granted the approval for that we are indeed trying to minimize civilian casualties to the extent we can, given the circumstances. And I think that this message is accepted by the governments of the various countries supporting us, and I think that for a good reason. As for the region, we need to follow attention, I think, on what's happening in the countries around us. Will the Egyptians increase humanitarian support? There was some reporting that they are reconsidering the possibility to allow Palestinians to come into Egypt for humanitarian medical treatment. I think this will be a good move by the Egyptians that express a lot of care to the humanitarian situation in Gaza. They can do more than just say it. They can do. And the other countries also, I hope, will need to follow. So this is kind of the scope of things that I'm following, and I think are important to look at. And let's go over to your questions.
Sure. So first of all, thank you very much for that. I think most of the questions focus on really the international scene and the diplomatic issues. But just before that, I do have a question about what we've seen up until now. We're nearing the end of the third week of retaliatory attacks, and we know that the IAF has bombed many targets. Are you able to kind of sum up what it has achieved so far in these strikes?
So I think from what I'm getting from conversations back home, you call it retaliatory. I mean, clearly there's a piece of it, but the aim was not to retaliate against Hamas. The aim was to damage their operational capabilities and to ultimately remove them for governance in Gaza. I think the amount of damage inflicted on their capabilities in the north of Gaza is quite dramatic compared to previous rounds. especially given the fact that until now we're using only aerial assaults and not ground assaults. Clearly, the leadership of Hamas are in hiding, and we don't see many hits on them. My understanding is that it's not the lack of knowledge necessarily of where they are, but they are indeed deeply behind the human shields, and Israel is even in these circumstances waiting for the opportunity to do this without inflicting too much casualties on civilian population in Gaza. So I think we'll see all of those. I think the civilian evacuation of northern Gaza is continuing, and this will be important by the time we move in. There were questions whether or not Hamas is experiencing shortage in rockets. I wouldn't expect them to experience shortage in rockets after only 3 weeks. We know the amounts that they have from before, but over time this will also come into effect. The impact of lack of electricity and supplies in the north of Gaza will also come into effect soon, and Hamas will need to come out of the tunnels at some point, and we'll be waiting.
Okay, so just before we move on to really the diplomatic spectrum and what Israel should be doing vis-a-vis different countries and allies, a question really about Iran. We understand that there were even some of the terrorists that participated in the attacks in Israel were actually trained in Iran. That's a report that came out yesterday. What are your thoughts on that? How deep does this go?
So yeah, I read this, of course. I think it was in the Wall Street Journal, and it shouldn't come as a surprise. I think those of you who've heard me in previous briefings, the Iranian involvement in building Hamas as a proxy, that's not a new phenomenon. We knew this and followed this, and clearly our attempts to mitigate that have failed. Ultimately, that is the case, but it wasn't a lack of knowledge of what they were doing. Most of the funding for Hamas military branch came from Iran, and with Qatari involvement, and we knew of training and equipment and other means. I think one of the questions that the Israeli system will need to ask itself will have to ultimately do with the use of preemptive strikes in such circumstances to surprise them before they surprise us, when we know that they have accumulated so much equipment and training and bases against us. Because when they surprise us, it's way more devastating, clearly, and that has happened also in the past. So that's something to remember for the future. I think not only in Gaza but also in Lebanon. When it comes to Hezbollah. As for Hamas itself, look, I think the Israeli government has said it clearly. I'm here in Washington, and also others. We put it out there very strongly. I think it's important for the international community to recognize that Hamas wasn't working only on behalf of its own brutality and terrorist ideology, but also as part of an attempt of Iran to mobilize the Arab countries in the region against not only Israel, but against prosperity of all sorts. President Biden himself said that what he hears from his intelligence community, that derailing the normalization effort with Saudi Arabia played in a very significant role in the decision-making process. I would expect that to be true both for Hamas and for Iran. And the fact that positive attempts and progress has been cut short this abruptly by those spoilers is something that all need to recognize and understand. Now, what will that say? We are calling. I've written about this myself in the beginning of this week. There must be an international understanding that those extremists are endangering not only Israel, the other peaceful-seeking countries in the region, and if not stopped, this will overflow also to other regions. It's clear. I mean, when terrorism isn't stopped at its core, it overflows. And some of you are coming from countries that have seen this over the last 2, 3 decades in the places that you come from. We sometimes use this as a cliche. I think at this point it's not just a cliche. Israel is fighting against terrorism, and we're on a front line. And if we don't succeed, that will have severe consequences on us, but ultimately it will have also severe consequences on the countries around us, and I think that even more globally. And Iran is the cause of that. And the fact that Iran can continue to go about their business, and the sunsets of on ballistic missiles have evaporated just last week, while they provide weapons to Russia in the war in Ukraine on the doorstep of some of the countries that you come from. I think it's mind-blowing that not enough is done to mitigate that and to push them back, even when something like this is happening, and it is clear that it is part of their strategy. This is something that the international community needs to address. Israel is now at war with Gaza. Will not open another front with Iran at the moment, but this is something that we all need to think about. How much room are we leaving to those who sponsor terror, promote, train, fund, and ultimately operate against the shared interests of us as a liberal world? This is something that I think we all need to ask ourselves and act upon.
I want to take you from that to maybe another question on what it would take for the international community, specifically the US, to become more involved. For example, we saw, I think it was maybe 4 or 5 years ago, the kind of tit for tat between the US, headed by Trump, of course, and Iranian proxies in the Gulf, and that was much more heated than it's ever been, and we haven't quite returned to that stage that it was. But what it would take to really get to a place where the US is actively taking role in some kind of combat, even against Iranian proxies. To the extent.
So I'm not sure I can answer that directly, but I would keep an eye open on the amount of American servicemen who have been attacked, injured. To my understanding, there are no casualties to date, and hopefully there won't be. But clearly, the Iranian proxies are ramping up against the American forces as well over the last 3 weeks, and this is something to follow up on. There were times where the American policy was that if a serviceman is hit, the United States strikes back. Clearly, the circumstances now are a little bit more tense, but this is definitely something to follow and also to address to American policymakers. Okay,
so in a different call, we'll do that. Bringing it back to Israel and what's going on now, in our territory, we saw kind of unprecedented cooperation, involvement, I don't know how you want to put it, with President Biden and Secretary Blinken, even participating in war room, maneuvering, which is really something quite different, quite big. Is that something that you think should be happening in a sovereign country? Do we need help? How will this take us, in the future when planning operations and so forth?
Yeah, so I've heard these comments. I wouldn't go as far to say that. I participated previously in the most deepest strategic conversations we had with the American administration's national security advisor. Israel and the U.S. tend to be very, very open to each other as it comes to these kind of issues. When there's a shared interest and a shared need and an American willingness to actively participate in what Israel is doing, it is always very, very welcome. Israel has moved from EUCOM to CENTCOM about 2 years ago, and one of the purposes of that was to increase integration between the regional activities that Israel is doing and the US. It didn't get so much focus before because it wasn't so open on the international media. But if you recall, there were an attempt of the Iranians to fire drones over to Israel 18 months ago or so, And there was an active joint assault room by CENTCOM and the IDF with sharing intel and planes in the air exchanging communications. We know how to do this when we need to. I think it's very clear that the Americans are not involved in the fighting, and they're not looking to be involved in the fighting, and I wouldn't expect them to be, nor would I want them to participate. There is an understanding in the U.S. This is something very, very different than what have been seen before. The Americans are also surprised. Of course, this is our backyard, so if we're surprised, clearly the Americans are as well. But I think it is taking the Americans also by complete, um, um, their analysis of the situation, their approach towards the threat coming from Hamas and from Iran at this point. They had very strong intelligence assessments on that as well, and I think they also feel that we're in the dark, and that confuses them as it comes to the first protection of American forces in the region as well. So there's a lot of good reasons for the Americans and the Israelis to work very closely together. I wouldn't go as far as putting this as a limit to it. I'm not hearing it, and I shouldn't expect that this will happen. Maybe I'll say that this wouldn't or shouldn't be the excuse that the Israeli leadership is taking for not going into action. They need to go into action. They would get the support from the Americans. It's a decision. It's a rough decision, but the Israeli leadership will need to make it. Netanyahu will need to make the decision ultimately and approve it in the cabinet. And I wouldn't suggest to hide behind the Americans on this. They won't block him from making the decision.
And what about other players in the region? I mean, we heard obviously Erdogan castigating Israel, which is not a surprise at all, but is Israel just recently started to finally warm up again to Turkey? How do you see this playing out?
Yeah, so I mean, when I was National Security Advisor and we approved the visit of President Herzog in Ankara in an attempt to open that relationship back, we had no illusions that Erdogan would change his initial ideology in support of Islamic Brotherhood and Hamas. And this was also clear when the Prime Minister met him in New York last September, and I mean, we had a good readout of Netanyahu's meeting with him, but I would assume that it's the same thing. Erdogan does not miss an opportunity in this case. He cannot really change his basic worldviews in support of Islamic Brotherhood, and the fact that he calls Hamas wouldn't single this out as a terror act is not a surprise, but very, very disappointing. And it's a shame because, again, I was talking before about the derailing of the process of normalization with Saudi Arabia. This will come back because the Saudis have decided to do this, and it's a shared interest of them and the Americans and us. As for Turkey, I think we all wanted to hope that we can do something meaningful, even when Erdogan is still in ruling of Turkey. And maybe that won't be the case. That's his decision to be made. He doesn't affect our decision-making process in any way.
Not even in the hope that Turkey might play some kind of role in prisoner exchange by pressuring Hamas, or that's not even.
They didn't play a constructive role in previous rounds, and I wouldn't expect them to play a constructive role right now. Qatar, on the other hand, is trying to do that, and also need to evade some of their misdoings in the past. And I would hope, I have to say, that there is a possibility to have a hostage exchange. There are many children and women and elderly held in Gaza for 3 weeks now. There is no reason for that to continue. Hamas need to release them. And there is a way to do this with mediation of, in this instance, Qatar. Then I would welcome it. That wouldn't remove the questions we need to ask Qatar about their involvement in building this threat, but I think it will be very important for them to project their ability to affect and lead to an humanitarian a solution such as that. Unfortunately, I do not expect the Turks to do the same.
We just have a couple last questions before we wrap up. Last week I asked you about the Russians, but I'll ask you again because since Putin obviously continued his support for Hamas, and even saying that if Israel continues the way it continues, that we might see a World War III. Is that something that you see coming out as a result of this? How do you think that Israel needs to behave with Putin right now?
So I have to say, I mean, it's again, if you would ask me if I'm surprised that he's saying that, unfortunately not. I think Putin, especially during the last several months and even a year, has been more aggressive in his coming closer strategically to Iran and his approach towards Israel. I think this came to Netanyahu as a surprise. I think Netanyahu was hoping that his past relationship with Putin will play more favorably, and clearly this is not happening because Russia's interests. This is not personal. This is more strategic, and their fight with the Western ideologies in this realm also have a toll on us. So Israel has been in a shifting viewpoint as it comes to Russia. Even when I was national security advisor, this process already started. And clearly, this is one of the things that this government needed to deal with. And I'm not sure that they had the mindset and priority to deal with it before. But clearly, there are questions that must be asked. We have to look more deeply. And I know that the military and intelligence are looking more deeply. What is Russia doing with Iran? What is Russia doing with the other adversaries? And to follow the support that they're giving to Hamas. The fact that they voted against us in the Security Council, unfortunately, does not come as a surprise yet. I don't remember when was the last time they voted in favor of Israel in the Security Council. That has been in a very long time. So we'll have to follow on this. Clearly, this is one of the strategic aspects of this conflict that we'll need to look carefully into.
Okay, just two last questions, and I'm bringing us back to Gaza, even though we keep leaving, but we keep coming back to Gaza. One journalist is asking why we presume that the hostages themselves aren't being kept in the south if we're telling the northern Gazans to evacuate all the time.
I hope that the intelligence have an understanding of where they are. If the question is it possible that they're in the north? Yes, it is possible that they're in the north. Is it possible that Hamas is holding them in places where they could later accuse Israel of killing them, using them also as human shields? Yes, and as you, I think, know, in the beginning of the conflict, there have been instances where Hamas used the phones of hostages to call their families and to tell them that they have died from Israeli raids. This was, definitely in time where Israel announced where it was going to bomb. So if they were there, it means that Hamas put them there to get them killed. I would assume that if Hamas wants to keep them alive, he will put them in the south where he can better protect them because he knows we're operating. But I wouldn't be too presumptuous to understand all of the Hamas considerations as it comes to that. I think inflicting pain on our society is more important to them at the moment for other strategic gains, and they've been ruthless when they took them, and I don't expect them to be less ruthless in negotiation, quote unquote, of their release.
Sure. Okay. And just the final question that obviously comes up every time. Israel's stated goals has been to get rid of Hamas, but what is the ultimate end goal that Israel has for the Gaza Strip when this is over?
Well, I can share with you what I think should have happened. I'm not sure if this is what the government is holding, and at this point, I don't see the government even 3 weeks into it doing what it takes to remove Hamas. I said this before, and I'm saying it now. I mean, time is ticking, and the window of legitimacy that Israel is getting won't last forever. It's been 3 weeks already, and I hope that Netanyahu has it to make the right decisions in the proper time as it comes to that. As for the outcome, my take on this is very simple. Hamas lost the legitimacy to rule people, to rule civilians, when they chose to murder Jews and Israelis in expense of the security and well-being of its own people. That's a very rough decision that it made on behalf of its own people, and I think this is widely recognized by the international community. And they have to move; they have to be removed from power. Now, who will rule Gaza? Israel should not conquer Gaza. Israel definitely shouldn't rule Gaza. There is a civilian level of officials that can maintain the life in Gaza, while other countries can also participate in thinking how to secure their ability to rule, so that militants don't come up again. This is what I would do if I was National Security Advisor. The moment I would start moving towards that direction with the other countries who view Hamas as a threat. Egypt surely views Hamas as a threat, and also other countries that have been inflicting on this. And it is time for the Arab countries to step up. If they worry so much about the humanitarian situation of the Gazans, and I expect that they say this genuinely, then it's time also to move ahead and to help, not to leave this only for Israel's responsibility, but to move ahead and create conditions where others can rule Gaza. There's always the question whether or not the Palestinian Authority can move in and rule Gaza. Maybe, I'm not sure that they're strong enough to do that, or even willing. But if this is an outcome of that, I would surely not oppose it. But clearly, it can't be ruled by a terrorist organization with such brutal conduct, not only on us but also on its own people.
Dr. Eyal Hulata, I am very curious to see what our next conversation in a week will look like and what will have changed by then. Former National Security Advisor and head of the Security Council in Israel, and visiting fellow of the FDD. Thank you again so much for your time. And
thank you, Talia, and thank you all.